because it showed up on my calendar.
Evocation and Invocation.
Yeah, I remember why I signed up. Okay. Yeah, let's do this.
Yeah, so this is a little more basic than usually what we talk about. I think it is valuable to visit these ideas just because sometimes when you start looking at the most basic aspects of things, it reveals other deeper things, and I think that's going to be a factor here. Just to look at the literal definitions, evocation, which in traditional ceremonial magic texts is synonymous essentially with exorcism, and we're pretty much looking at the same idea. We're taking an object, a sigil, something, and we're bringing what is supposedly an intelligence that inhabits this space, taking it out and putting it in a different place so we can interact with it, and it becomes sort of manifest in the external world, and it's out there and we can deal with it. Invocation is more bringing in to ourselves, and that's kind of where we're like dealing with bringing energies in. Usually, sometimes as a preface to a bigger ritual when we're trying to get the right elemental balance or balance of planetary forces. Sometimes we're dealing with invoking specific entities and kind of like having them inhabit.
Are we invoking it into ourselves, or if it just depends on where you're
It kind of depends on what you're doing, but yeah, that's the idea. And both these tools really heavily rely on two of the main tools in ceremonial magic, which are the circle and the triangle. And in evocation, we need both of these in evocation, whereas in invocation we really only need the circle. In a lot of ways, evocation is a lot more complicated, so we may end up spending more time on that. The circle in the invocation, I think it's helpful to see it as like a filter. So when you bring this energy in, you have your magical circle, which is a representation of your psychological universe, your magical universe, the symbols that you would identify most strongly with. And in evocation, the circle is more for protection, like to keep out the thing that we've evoked into the triangle and make sure that it doesn't have access to us. And whereas the triangle is just a container, essentially, something that we put this entity in so that it can manifest and we can interact with it more directly. What these have in common, which differentiates them from banishing rituals, which is kind of like something that I think people focus on maybe a little too much sometimes. It's important to do, it's important to keep a clear space and stuff like that, but you can definitely over-banish and you can definitely push away things that you'd rather have brought in towards you. But in both invocation and evocation, they demand a reaction. So we will know if we get a result very quickly. Even if an evocation is a complete failure, and sometimes you can get to the point where you can like see the spirit, talk to the spirit, completely apprehend the spirit, and it just doesn't work for whatever reason. And sometimes it's very difficult to determine what that is. The only way we can do that is by keeping consistent notes and looking at the consistent factors and the workings that are successful and that fail. There is a tendency, I think, to confine this a little too much to just the ritual space. I'm not a huge fan of Israel Regardie, but one of the most important things I think that he says is, especially when you're learning the tables from 777 and the colors and stuff like that, to really keep that in your head. And he has this piece of advice where he says, you should go on maybe just like 20-minute walk every day and just try to categorize the correspondences of those colors as you're going about your walk, and just like trying to focus on that. Because the more you have these things in your head, the more the associations are directly there. And I would strongly recommend that people do this with the pentagram and hexagram. You see a physical object you would like to have closer to you, it doesn't hurt to like mentally trace a pentagram of earth. If you're trying to attract someone's attention, it doesn't hurt to mentally trace a pentagram of fire, so on and so forth. I'm not going to say that has a direct effect when you're doing it at the time, but it helps to make those associations between those ideas and the pentagrams, which in turn makes them more effective when you use them in a ritual setting. And really, the more information you can pack into those symbols, then the more benefit you can get out of invoking rituals of any kind. And I think this tendency that I'm talking about to sort of isolate these things in a ceremonial context comes from an idea that we see in anthropology. It's called the Great Divide, where they talk about the division between pre-modern thinking and modern thinking. And in modern thought, these things are very categorized and very compartmentalized. And if you look at what would be described as the pre-modern world, for example, a hunter goes out and they might have a dream about where to find an animal, and then the animal itself has spiritual energy that they're interested in, and then they'll make a sacrifice to appease the spirit of that animal and stuff like that. It's all harmoniously connected in that entire action, whereas we just don't think about things like that. There's a really interesting thinker who I would advise people to look into called Bruno Latour. And the book specifically where he talks about this is called either We Are Not Modern or We Were Never Modern, something to that effect. It basically says this great divide is actually an illusion created by language. And in fact, we still do think this way, even though we tell ourselves it's about different things. And I mean, I've talked about this in lectures before. You might talk to someone who's completely atheistic and has no, connection to any religion. But if you look at the way they interact with, for example, their favorite band, their favorite artists, it is very close to a religious kind of devotion, and in fact has many of the same characteristics in common. And in academic religious studies, we look at this a lot. I remember there's actually one guy writing his thesis at the same time as I did that did it on Rock in Rio, the Iron Maiden concert, as a religious celebration. And I read an article where there was someone trying to define religion and trying to come up with a definition of religion that included everything that was a religion but didn't include professional wrestling. And that was very difficult to do because it turns out that it has almost all the same characteristics. We just see it as a secular manifestation, so we don't think about it that way, and we don't realize how this colors our thinking. And I think that a big thing that the tradition of ceremonial magic comes from is people trying to knock down that so-called Great Divide. Because traditional ceremonial magic was sort of revived in the 19th century when you had a very strong anti-rationalist movement as a reaction to the late Enlightenment type thinking where everything was that compartmentalized and people were not as directly involved with or connected with their spiritual practices. And just keeping these things in your head on a regular basis is a way of knocking that down, and also a really good way to effectively deal with spirits, because when you start doing ceremonial magic and you start interacting with these entities, what we don't realize is they interact back. Like, they become aware of us. I have a difficult time believing people who say that they don't do ceremonial magic but they've been contacted by spiritual entities. I'm sure it occasionally happens, but it certainly doesn't happen as frequently as there are people who claim that it's happened to them. In many cases, these are schizophrenics or cases of mental illness and stuff like that. Because the language of ceremonial magic makes it very easy for people to explain away their problems. Yes?
What about folk magic practitioners? Do you interact with spirits on a
Yeah.
basis? Isn't that contacted by spiritual entities?
Well, and that's people coming out of a long tradition. So I think that in that context,
And we're not drawing circles or triangles.
yes.
We're
Well,
birds and crystals.
oh yeah, there's very different ways of interacting with these entities, certainly. The reason that these things come up in ceremonial magic is because there is a sense of we are externalizing the internal. Like the temple space is key, whereas I think in folk magic you don't see the concept of a temple space as frequently. So this is a sense, your temple space is like an extension of yourself, and you have these symbols everywhere which are meant to light up those centers of your brain that are associated with these energies and these actions. And it just makes it much easier to perform these kind of rituals, to have that level of association. I mean, one thing I've always said about an evocation is it's a really bad idea to do it in a room if you've got, like, a bookshelf on the wall, pictures of your family up there, stuff like that, like you want to cover stuff like that up, because just accidentally glancing at it during the course of the ritual will break your concentration. And concentration and